This is House Planning Help, episode 145. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Bernard Tulkens from Tectonic Architects, and we're going to have a case study today and hear the story behind his award-winning passive house called Lansdowne Drive. This was part of the UK Passivhaus Awards for this year. If you're a regular listener, then you will have probably heard a couple of episodes as I travelled from house to house on the shortlist. Well, this one I didn't get time to do, so I'm very happy to have returned there. And just while we're talking about the Passivhaus Trust, their website is certainly a great resource. So this is one of the affiliates of the International Passivhaus Association, and on their website, I don't know whether all the affiliates have the same layout, but I think this is really good because there are fact files, so you can go through all of the different houses and buildings, just get some inspiration, perhaps find out who did this on that project if it's something that you like. There's a video archive as well, useful guides, whether it's just getting started or why choose passive house or how to build a passive house, all the details that you want. And then the event side of things, probably one of the top ones that you might be interested in is the Passive House Open Days, which come at the end of the year each year and just allow you to go and experience a passive house. It's still relatively new if you think in terms of numbers compared to traditionally built houses. So go in there, feel that comfort. Hopefully it's a very cold day so you can take advantage of that and get nice and snug inside. The other thing is, I know that they're working on a new campaign aimed specifically at us, self-builders, which I can't tell you about at the moment, but I just know because Regen Media is producing the video for this. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that I think it's going to be a really useful one, and I'll tell you about that as soon as I can when it's all on the go. Let's get to our interview then. This is with Bernard Tulkens, and really quite an interesting project because perhaps the size, it's 94 square meters, yet the house, it feels quite big on the inside because it's got some open spaces, slightly industrial, a bit like having a studio space, flexible as well. And it's nestled in amongst Victorian terrace, so very different to all the others, zinc clad. It uses cross-laminated timber, that's the system. And it's just embracing simplicity all round. So let's dive in. We'll get started with Bernard. I just asked him to tell me a little bit about his background.
Well, I'm an architect. I've been an architect for about 12 years. Prior to that, I worked for big international companies on commercial projects all over Europe. Now my practice is a small business I've got 3 employees, and I do mostly residential projects. Although my interest is diverse, I'm interested in public spaces, but at the moment business has taken me towards the residential market, which I enjoy.
Well, that suits us as well. We are sitting in your award-winning passive house. We did a number of these interviews when I went around, but I think we were under a bit of a time pressure when we were here last. So maybe you could just explain how this project began.
It began with buying my own house. I bought a house which had a garden, but the garden had been extended by the previous owner. And this extension of the garden led to another street. So it was an ideal small infill site on which to build a house. I decided to build something, not for sale. I just thought it would be a good thing to do for the future. I didn't have a particular client in mind, but designed this 2-story, 2-bedroom house with 2 bathrooms. And started construction. During construction, my in-laws decided to move in. So now you're sitting in effectively their house with their furniture. I adapted the house a little bit to their request, but not really. Fundamentally, the project is the same. There was no client, so I was very much free to decide how I would finish the house, and this is the result.
That's obviously a very different approach. So was it even slightly daunting? Because you'd never done this before, I assume.
I'd never done this before. I never built a passive house before. I never built, I built buildings for clients. I did very successful projects for my clients, but I was never in the position of being the client. In this case, being the client and the architect and finding to decide financially what makes sense, what doesn't make sense is actually tricky. It's quite nice. In many ways, it is easier to have a client. So the project evolved very slowly because my priority was to run my small business, and the decisions came gradually. But I think it fell into place quite naturally in the end.
When was the right time to start it? Because you mentioned buying your house and you could see the potential, but you didn't start straight away at all, did you?
Oh, not at all. No, we bought our house in 2004, and eventually I got planning in 2010. So I think we just thought there is no reason to rush. 2008 financial crisis meant that I couldn't borrow any money anyway. The financial difficulties were probably the biggest hurdle in starting the project. I mean, banks would tell me, "You don't know anything about development, do you?" Well, yes, I made my clients rich, but it's true, I was not a developer. It's true that I didn't have the financial, I didn't have any other assets I could give them. So borrowing was tricky, and that made the project develop very slowly. Now, once you've got planning, there is a bit of a time pressure, because you get planning for 3 years. You can extend it, you can reapply, but it is better to start within the period.
How did you set your budget then?
I went to see lenders to find out how much money I could borrow. I had, on the other hand, the project, the building that had planning permission. And I thought, okay, how can I make it as simple as possible? And what would that cost? And on the other hand, I had the financial people looking at me saying, we can give you 300 max at an extortionate price. And I thought, there we go.
So this was largely borrowed money, and it sounded like that you did the planning first. So is that what came first, the sort of building that you might create?
Yeah, the planning permission was the first thing I decided to do. I first tried to do a project where I would have 2 units. One would be a house, one would be either a house or small unit that I could maybe use differently. I could sell one of the 2 and keep the other one, which would be a good mechanism for financing it. But it brought with it a lot of complication in the sense that it was more development, which the council wasn't so keen on. It was also more expensive. When you do 2 units, the cost is higher. And in the end, sort of very wisely, I'm very happy with that decision. We decided to keep it. We probably underdeveloped the site, which is not what you should do. But in our case, it allowed us to borrow less, and second, to keep it, which is what we want to do, because for our family, it's brilliant. We have these two places where now my in-laws can be, and I didn't have the financial obligation to sell in order to survive the operation.
You mentioned that you didn't really have a client, but what did you want to create?
Well, architects, I wanted to create a lovely space. I wanted to create a simple building where the enjoyment of space and light would be the most important thing. So what I've done is this big upper level room that looks over gardens. And I think it's got this simplicity and this unusual character. In terms to best define, it's hard to say what I didn't have a very clear image, but I wanted the atmosphere you get in a studio, in an industrial building that you visit. Open plan, lots of light, and you think, what else do you need? And I think I've managed to do that in the end. The bedrooms are below. The big upper space is a living space that's open plan. And the house feels very, very simple.
What were the constraints of this site?
Well, the constraints of the site are multiple. First of all, it's in a conservation area. So the volume, the mass, the appearance, the privacy of the neighbors, the light for the neighbors, all that come into play. So there are multiple aspects to this, but like the alignment on the street or how much of a garden. I wanted to keep a garden. So the massing of the building was a very key thing. The building is also half sunken to remain low, which was a suggestion, inverted comma, from the planners.
A good one?
And, yes, in the end, it did add probably about £100,000 to the cost of the building. But you can understand why they want this building to be low. On the other hand, they were happy for the building to be different. So they didn't ask me to design a mock Victorian building. I was very pleased that it didn't need to look like everything else around. And it does look very different.
How did you develop that design then to make it something architecturally special? You clearly had this simple vision.
Take time, sketch a lot, work on the layout, work on the appearance from the outside, think about it. I think the luxury here I had was time. Thank God for that. Being client architects, trying to find out what costs what looks like, how to organize, how am I going to meet all the different things I wanted to put in the building is just time. And nobody was paying me for doing this. I just enjoyed working on it. I think that's the key. I think you focus on a few ideas, and it takes time for these ideas to settle and turn into the project.
In terms of materials, you've kept it simple, but were you having to use concrete, for example, in the basement because you dug down and so forth, and then explain about the cross-laminated timber?
Well, to a certain extent, you have technical constraints. Yes, if you build down, you're not going to do your basement in timber or in straw bale. But no, I think the idea of the construction and the idea of the space are really intertwined. They come together as an idea. And from the start, I thought I want to do this large space, a small house with large spaces. And on the other hand, I liked cross-laminated timber because it offered the possibility of exposed construction. It's quite fascinating. It's big elements that are installed in a very, very simple way. It also is good for environmentally, and it's good for low air leakage. So it has a lot of benefits. And putting the two together, when you design the plan, you suddenly realize, okay, this works with the construction technique you want to use. So that one idea is reinforced by the use of the right material. I like concrete in many ways, but it's just really the shell of the lower ground floor. The decision to have it exposed is a bit financial, it's a bit aesthetic. It's not a decorative decision, but it just came naturally when you assemble materials and you say, well, why do anything else? There you go. Also the passive house choice, which came quite late in the process. After planning, with developing the scheme, and I realized actually this way of building allows me to meet a lot of the criteria of passive house. I could create good air tightness. I could insulate well. I can eliminate all the cold bridges, which is a massive gain. And yes, I can then create this environment which will make a passive house, a very, very low energy building. One of the other things that I had in my mind is if I put a building up and I would like to use natural materials. So the choice of using wood fiber and cross-laminated timber. It's a breathable construction, but wood fiber I think it's made from the waste of the timber industry. So all the ideas, if you want, point in the same direction. And that's what takes time on a project, is to make sure that the various choices you make all end up pointing in the same direction, rather than have conflicts between the different choices.
Because I remember when I interviewed your cross-laminated timber specialist, that he was saying that this was one of the first passive house projects that he'd done. I don't know whether I'm bringing that out of context. So how did you find him? How were you confident in this? Were you looking abroad to Europe?
Cross-laminated timber has been used in the UK for a while, but I think this is the first passive house using it. How did I find them? They're a well-known company. In London, there are 3 or 4 that are around. I think Liam showed interest in the fact that it was a passive house. It's a small project, so let's be clear, from a financial point of view, from a business point of view, for a company like them, it's not very interesting. It's one of these small projects that require a lot of work and bring little money. But they were interested in doing it because it was a passive house, and it went very smoothly. So I'm delighted, and I think they were quite happy too.
Being a passive house with no south-facing glazing, can you explain how you overcame those challenges?
Yes, we were talking about the constraints of the site first, and we talked about the planning constraints. There are also just simple environmental constraints. When I first decided to make a passive house, I actually visited different consultants to find out who I would do this with. And one of them told me, you could do Code 6, Code for Sustainable Homes, Level 6. But it was not really interesting for me. It's got a lot of box ticking of things I didn't need to do. And I said, what about passive house? And he said, well, the site's not very good for passive house. I don't think you can do that. So I went to see other people. 2 years later, I still thought passive house is really something that I would like to explore. And I looked more into how you do it or what it takes to do it. And I couldn't understand why it would not be possible. But the devil is in the detail. Passive house, you've got to really analyze the construction to death. And very luckily, I met this passive house designer, so Peter Rankin, who accepted to take on the challenge. He looked at the building shape. He looked at the principles of how I was going to erect this structure. And he realized this works. It's like a diagram for passive house. It's very straightforward. The shape is good. The lines of insulation are continuous. There is no thermal bridge. Yes, it doesn't have much sun from the south. It has maybe a couple of hours in the peak of summer in the lower ground bathroom, but we have the western sun. And by looking at the materials, their properties and the U value in the glass, we found a balance between a lot of insulation in the walls and letting more sun in from the west, so having a glazing that's more transparent to the west, and he made it work. And that's what I love about the passive house principle, is that you can decide how you achieve it. All you've got to do is feed the properties of the material and the calculations into the planning system, which Peter did. I didn't do that. He was great because he was analyzing our ideas and coming back like an independent, telling me, yeah, this works, or let's modify this, and it was exactly how the system should be used. And in the end, you demonstrate that you meet the energy criteria for passive house.
We have 4 lovely large windows that look out onto those gardens. It makes you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere, although this is central London. Questions then on shading. First of all, how are you shading? And secondly, what happens if those shades don't work? Have you ever tested it on a really sunny day just to keep those shades off?
Oh, it's definitely clear that not in the winter, but May to September, after 2 p.m., you get the sun all afternoon. It actually starts from about 12:30, but the sun comes through these windows, and it's lovely on a perfect English day, overcast. Okay, you get the right temperature without the sunshade. But when it's a blue sky and very strong sun, you have to have the shading. If you don't have it, well, you open the windows at the back and the front, and it ventilates. But if it's 25 degrees outside, you are likely to have, with windows open, 25 degrees inside. But so far, the building has performed very well. The shades are nice because they allow you to see through them. So it's a roller blind. It's got a micro perforation, so it casts a shadow, but you can still see the vegetation outside. You still feel the outside. You could open the windows, of course. And the wood fiber has also a property of being a bit better than extruded polystyrene in terms of thermal inertia and thermal mass. So it absorbs the heat more than an artificial material would. So when it's not extreme summer, actually it's cooler inside than it is outside, which is a really, really nice feeling. I still have to put the sedum roof on the waterproofing of the flat roof. And that would also help the protection on very hot days.
Were there any other challenges through construction?
Passive house requires a lot of attention to detail. I think the great thing about that is to keep the details simple, because if it's simple, it's easier to make. But yes, you have to be there, accuracy of openings and then how the windows fit. You need to, everybody talks about the tapes and the silicone, but if the materials are designed to fit next to each other, putting the tape, etc., is important, but it's not a real challenge. We discovered some funny little quirky details around the window edges. Well, no, I think it's just keeping it simple and supervising every step. And there again, I was lucky because I was living next door. So my presence on site was much more than in a traditional system where I would be visiting once or twice a week. No, I was on site every day, probably 3 times a day, because my office was literally next door. And having had no general contractor, there was no other logic than the proper progress of the work. Contractors obviously they want to do a good job, but they have another agenda, which is efficiency and making a profit out of the construction. Here, I would select a trade, people would come and do their job, we could analyze it, and then we could move on to the next one. So the amount of supervision that I could provide was a great help. Did we have difficulties? Yes, we built a concrete wall and the shuttering was not up to scratch. So it was when we had to stop the pour. The wall ended up a bit thicker than we wanted, so we lost a bit of insulation, so we had to do extra calculation to demonstrate that we're still meeting Passive House. But overall, I've sort of forgotten the bad bits, to be honest. I think I could easily say, no, it went smoothly. If I really look back at my diary, I'll probably find that wasn't.
What about your budget then? Because that was obviously, there was a number, you had to hit it. All okay there?
I spent more than I imagined, but mostly because of two things. The groundworks were tricky, and there was no drain on the street that the building's faces, so we had to bring the drain about 25 meters away from the site, a bit more than that, and that cost £40,000. So it was, before we started construction, we had already spent £80,000 excavation and enabling of the site, etc. But the whole shell, with windows, with MVHR, with electrics, etc., was done within the numbers that I actually predicted. Then some of the finishes that you see, from the shelving to the curtains or the blinds and things like that, come extra, and those were done because my in-laws were moving in, and because I thought it was worth doing.
And you've exposed things like the MVHR, so did that almost follow suit from the way that you were building?
That was the idea way before I knew who would be living in this building. My plan there was to create a nice space and say, why start to put battens and hide and plaster and skim and move having a PowerPoint. If you want to move it, you need to call the electrician, the plasterer, the decorator no, here it's very simple. You see conduits, they are screwed in. If you want to move a point, you can do it. The MVHR is a duct of 150 mils suspended from the ceiling. The services are only hidden in the bathrooms, where I felt with the moisture from the showers, with the amount of cables that have to come from the electric board to the different points there. So I've got two small areas of suspended ceiling, and in the rest in the corridor, the distribution routes obviously were carefully planned. You have to know where you want them visually if you decide to expose the material. But that was a very simple decision. Why spend so much time, energy doing plasterboard and worse, shadow gap, skirtings, all these things that actually end up costing a lot of money? So it was also driven by a desire to reduce the cost and simplify construction.
Are there any lessons learned, things that you might do differently or just of interest along the way?
Yes, of course, I would do it again. That's the first lesson. I think very positive. I think the desire to expose material on the inside is lovely, but I think that's more the fact that it was a building that I wanted to develop with other clients. I don't think it's not an aesthetic choice, you see. And when you build for most people, in the end, there is an aesthetic decision that's got to be made. And you realize that the exposed material here is lovely, but it might not be for everyone. I think one thing that comes quite strongly for me is this attention to the simple process, and using nice and natural materials is probably very important. Having followed the sequence of the construction, you realize there is way too much construction products that I think should just not be used. I mean, you want to limit the amount of extruded polystyrene you use. I think the use of natural materials is, it's a bit like you can feel it when the building is finished, and that's a great lesson. But that's not a surprise for anybody. Time is having the time to do things one by one was a great luxury, and how can you have that every time? Yeah.
How long did it take overall?
Well, we started construction. It took a year from the time we started to the time we completed. It took a year, but what we did is work extremely fast at the beginning. The concrete took about 6 weeks, concrete works, and then we did the 2-day installation of the cross-laminated timber. And the windows came, and I wrapped up the building in an airtightness layer. So within 2 months, you would walk inside a building. Then it took much longer to do all the internal fit outs because I didn't have all the contacts and the trays, etc. So I was waiting for somebody to wrap my building up in wood fiber insulation. He's a specialist that I brought from Ireland. And one of my best decisions is to say, let's wait for the man you want. And he did come in January, and 3 months later, the building was wrapped up in insulation. I had the opportunity to do the zinc finish, and the building was complete. So it took overall a year, which is not too bad.
As we get towards the end here, do you have any advice for people developing infills, particularly in cities? It's so tricky. I find even on the outskirts of London, it's tough, but you're right in the middle.
What advice would I have? I would say the great pleasure here is the light I managed to get. And actually, in the end, infill sites, I think they will look natural if you can get a lot of light. We kept a garden at the back, which was a very good decision. And it makes it feel like a house rather than like an infill development pushed a little bit, pushing the boundaries. I think the self-built aspect, I think, is a tricky one because it's really due to my particular circumstance of having the site next door to my office and owning land. So I think if I had to do a project like this with a client, it would probably, I think it's patience is probably the advice that what people need.
And finally, what do you make of it all now? It's complete. You've won an award for it. How's it like to reflect on and your in-laws who come and stay here?
I think they like it a lot. I still like it a lot.
Good.
And no, it's very comfortable. It's very comfortable.
Bernard, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've been taking the notes so that you don't have to. houseplanninghelp.com/145 today, where you can review the key points. We've got a handful of photos taking you right through the construction process to the finished build. There's the video as well that we shot for the UK Passivhaus Awards. And if you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, just scroll to the bottom of the show notes. We'll link you across to Tectonics Architects, their website, all at houseplanninghelp.com/145. Just as we finish up today, quite an exciting announcement that we have a new video case study that we are introducing into the hub. This one's going to be slightly different because Longbarrow, Alex Bain's very much at the forefront. He was happy to be on camera. So this time around, we got permission to get on site and show you all the process and how it's coming together. But the clients themselves don't want to be on camera, which is fair enough. So I focus very much on the team on this one. Buckinghamshire Passivhaus is a timber frame build and it's using the PH15 system from Passivhaus Homes. I'll perhaps link the podcast that we did with Janet Cottrell before, just explaining about that system, into the show notes. So this one has a floor area, this is off the top of my head, so it may be completely wrong, of around about 350 square meters. Janet Cottrell and Adam Dadabai, we've spoken to them both on the podcast before, and they put together the Passivhaus handbook, so very excited. Janet Cottrell and Adam, they really know what they're talking about, and Janet is going to be our guide through this project. So the first video, as I mentioned, hoping to get that in the hub this month. Also, in amongst hub membership, we've got the quarterly progress calls, the monthly modules, just trying to lay everything out step by step as best we can, the private members forum, all for £99 a year. And this price will be increasing at the end of the year. So get in quick. houseplanninghelp.com/join will tell you more. Next time, Emma Osmondson is my guest from Exeter City Council. She's really switched on a mission too, as you will hear, but I want to chat to her and get her thoughts on whether engaging with your council could help advance your self-build. That's it though for now. Thank you so much for being there. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.